Denis Villeneuve's gorgeous and mostly faithful adaptation of Frank Herbert's Dune has finally been released, and boy did it live up to the hype. In this video, we are going to recap the movie's important ending, what it all means, and how it set up a spicy part 2, pun very much intended. Let's go! Oh, and spoiler warning, there will be some massive Dune spoilers in this video. As we know, House Atreides was sent to the desert planet of Arrakis by order of the Padishah Emperor and are tasked with leading spice production on the planet. However, this task is ultimately doomed, as it was actually a trap set by the Emperor and the leader of their rival house, Baron Harkonnen, and the Atreides soon learn that they are destined for failure. The Harkonnens, alongside the Emperor's personal elite army, the Sardaukar, throw a coup, ousting the Atreides, killing their leader, Duke Leto. Okay, he technically killed himself, but still, along with a number of other fan favorites such as Liet Kynes and Duncan Idaho. The movie's main protagonist, Paul, and his mother, Jessica, are taken out into the deserts of Arrakis to be left for dead, but manage to make their escape before heading off to find the local natives, the Fremen. Meanwhile, with the Harkonnens back in control of Arrakis, they look to restore all the profits that they've lost by regaining as much spice as they can and exterminate the Fremen, although we already know how much they underestimate the Fremen. Speaking of the Fremen though, as Paul and Jessica navigate the dunes, they're attacked by a ravenous sandworm and are nearly killed until Fremen man, Jamis, uses a device known as the Thumper to call the worm away. Paul and Jessica are then surrounded by a band of Fremen, which includes Javier Bardem's Stilgar. Stilgar says that while Paul is young enough to learn the Fremen ways, Jessica is too old and untrained and orders to have her killed, until he learns all too well that she is in fact trained as she kicks his ass. Stilgar then decrees that Jessica is indeed fit enough to be welcomed into the Fremen community, but this is challenged by Jamis, who also makes a point to say that Paul is not the messiah that he's made out to be. Jamis then enacts the Tahati Challenge, which is effectively a fight to the death and challenges Lady Jessica's champion in combat, which is, of course, Off-Worlder Paul. This is when some of the visions and dreams that Paul's been having throughout the movie begin to come true, as the literal girl of his dreams, Chani, gifts him with a blade, a crysknife to be exact, which is made from the tooth of a sandworm and is the ceremonial blade of the Fremen. Before they fight, Jamis tells Paul that he will never survive on Arrakis, and death by his blade is a mercy, but soon realizes that Paul is the better fighter. But as he is not trained in Fremen ways, Paul does not kill Jamis at first and is reluctant to take a life as he's never done so before. The Fremen believe that he's toying with Jamis though, as yielding is not an option in the Tahati Challenge. So Paul eventually finishes off Jamis once and for all. After defeating Jamis, Paul is officially welcomed by the Fremen, as it is a life for a life, and he and Jessica are welcomed. Along the way, Paul witnesses one of the Fremen riding a sandworm, something which was assumed impossible by the outsiders, and labeled this as desert power, an expression coined by his father, who told Paul that they needed to harness it. Chani then tells him that this is just the beginning, thus setting up a sequel, hopefully. Now, seeing as the movie covered more or less half of the book, saying this is just the beginning is a bit of an understatement, as there is still a lot of story to cover, and there are visions and premonitions seen in part 1, such as Paul and the Fremen ambushing the Sardaukar, that have yet to come true. Now, if you're a book reader like me, you'll probably be sitting there pretty smug, as we can be relatively sure what's going to happen next. But seeing as giving any spoilers away would be the absolute epitome of douchebaggery, we are not going to do that here. That goes for you guys too in the comment section, by the way. However, we can talk about some of the plot threads that have been planted for part 2, but if you feel like this is still a bit too spoilery, feel free to check out here. As I said though, I'll try and keep the rest of the discussion as spoiler-free as possible. As we mentioned, while the vision of Chani and the crysknife all come to fruition towards the end of the movie, there were some noticeable visions that have yet to come to life, such as Paul with his spice eyes and gold armor attacking a group of Sardaukar. Seeing as Paul is out for revenge after what the Emperor and the Harkonnens did to his family, you can bet that will be on his mind in part 2. And he even alluded to his grand plan to Liet Kynes, as he hinted that he wanted to make a play on the throne itself. Seeing as the Atreides are one of the most popular houses in Dune lore, and the Emperor went against code by aligning himself in a house war, you can bet that there will be some repercussions in part 2. Also, with the hue of Paul's eyes, you can also bet on the fact that he will be meddling with Melange as he looks to fulfill the prophecy of him being the Messiah. Also, we will likely see him embed himself with the Fremens even further, learning more about their society as he tries to harness desert power, if you know what I mean. As I said though, I don't really want to get into spoilers, so I'm not going to go any further, because unlike the Padishah Emperor, I stick to my principles, damn it! Other plot points that were planted in part 1 was the fact that Arrakis can be a terraformed, prosperous planet, but due to the Empire's greed and love of spice, they decided to keep it a barren, dangerous wasteland. Also, Lady Jessica's pregnant, so expect to see that bear some fruit in part 2. And of course, with the Harkonnens about to ravage Arrakis and hunt down the Fremen with Beast Raban leading the charge, expect there to be more fighting, destruction, and violence in part 2. But who even knows if the saga will end in part 2? Not only is it not a sure thing, with there still being many more novels in the series, if part 1 and potentially part 2 are successful enough, if we're lucky, we may get to see more live-action adaptations in the future.